She stepped off the train with a leather satchel in one hand and a folded paper in the other, and the rancher standing on the platform had no idea that the most dangerous thing in Colton County had just arrived, wearing a blue travelling dress. His name was Cal Pruitt, 34 years old, broad through the shoulders, quiet in the way that men who work alone tend to get quiet. He'd been standing on that platform for 40 minutes, turning his hat in his hands, watching the locomotive bleed steam into the October sky. He was nervous. You could see it in the set of his jaw, the way he kept looking at the paper in his breast pocket, the letter from the agency in San Francisco that had arranged this whole thing. He'd read it so many times the fold lines had gone white. Her name on the paper was Maylene. The woman who stepped off the train was also named Maylene. That was the first and last thing about this situation that was exactly what it appeared to be. She was 28 years old, and she had been hired 11 days ago by a man named Harlan Voss to end Cal Pruitt's life before the first snow. Voss wanted the land. He wanted the water rights that ran through Cal's eastern pasture. He wanted the deed to the Pruitt Ranch, which had been in Cal's family for 31 years and which sat directly between Voss's two existing properties, like a stone in a boot. Voss had tried lawyers. He had tried lowball offers. He had tried a fence dispute that went nowhere. And now he had tried Maylene, which was the kind of decision men like Harlan Voss made when they had run out of patience and convinced themselves that money solved everything, including the problem of a stubborn rancher who wouldn't sell. What Voss did not know, what almost nobody knew, was that Maylene had been doing this work for 6 years, and in 6 years she had never once let sentiment interfere with the job. She was very good at her work. She was also, in ways that would not become clear for another 36 hours, not entirely who she had decided to be. Cal crossed the platform toward her. He moved the way men move when they're trying not to look like they're trying too hard. Measured steps, chin up, hat held at his side. He stopped 3 feet away and looked at her the way you look at something you've been told to expect but still can't quite believe is real. "Miss Maylene," he said. She looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. She was measuring him the way she measured everyone: threat level, physical capability, emotional tells. What she found was a man with calloused hands and an honest face, and eyes that were doing something she hadn't expected. They were kind. "Mr. Pruitt," she said. Her English was precise and unaccented. She had grown up in Sacramento, the daughter of a laundry owner who had believed fiercely and with some justification that his children would need to be twice as capable as everyone around them just to get half as far. Cal nodded once, slowly, like a man confirming something to himself. Then he reached out and took her satchel before she could stop him. "Train ride all right," he said. "It was fine," she said. "Hungry?" "A little." He nodded again. "I've got a wagon out front. May Hollis. She runs the boarding house on Clement Street. She made a pot roast. I thought you might want to eat somewhere that wasn't a train car." Maylene looked at him. She thought about the vial in her satchel, the one Voss's man had given her in a Sacramento hotel room. She thought about the 3 days she had been given. She thought about the money, enough to disappear properly, to stop doing this work, to go somewhere no one knew her name. "That sounds fine," she said. And they walked off the platform together, a rancher and a woman he believed was going to be his wife, and the afternoon light fell long and gold across the dust of Colton, Nevada, and if you'd been standing there watching them go, you might have thought it looked almost peaceful. It was not peaceful. It was the beginning of something that neither of them had a name for yet. The wagon ride out to the Pruitt Ranch took 40 minutes on a road that had been graded once, and left to its own devices since roughly 1871. The land on either side was high desert, sage and juniper, the occasional cluster of cottonwoods where water ran underground, low hills going purple in the distance as the sun dropped. It was the kind of landscape that felt indifferent to human presence, in a way that was either desolate or clarifying, depending on who you were and what you were carrying. Cal drove. Maylene sat beside him on the bench seat with her satchel between her feet and her hands folded in her lap. She was watching the land the way she watched everything, cataloguing, assessing, filing information away. She noted the distance from the road to the nearest cover. She noted where the fence lines ran. She noted that Cal Pruitt kept his rifle in a scabbard behind the seat, within reach but not in hand, which told her something about his habits. He talked a little, not nervously, not the way a man talks to fill space because silence scares him. He talked the way people talk when they're trying to be decent, offering information without demanding anything in return. He told her the ranch was about 1,200 acres, most of it grazing land, some of it too rocky for much of anything. He told her he ran about 200 head of cattle, that he had a hand named Doss who lived in the bunkhouse, and did most of the hard work with the livestock while Cal handled the business side. He told her the house was nothing fancy, but it was solid, that his father had built it in 1861 from timber hauled up from the valley, that the roof had been replaced twice since then, and the third replacement was probably coming due. He did not tell her why he'd written to the agency. Men rarely explained that part right away. But she could read the shape of it. The ranch was real. The work was real. The life was real. And he was doing it alone, which after a certain number of years starts to weigh on a person in ways they can't always name. "You have family?" she asked. It wasn't idle conversation. She was building a picture. "Not anymore," he said. "Father passed in 83. Mother went 2 years before that. Brother moved to Portland. We don't correspond much." He paused. "You?" "My father is in Sacramento," she said. "My mother died when I was 12. This was true. She gave him truth when she could. It was a professional habit. The more real details you used, the less you had to track." "I'm sorry," he said. "It was a long time ago." They went quiet for a while. The wagon wheels found a rut and both of them shifted with the movement, their shoulders briefly touching. Neither of them acknowledged it. The ranch came into view as they crested a low rise. The main house, a barn, 2 outbuildings, a water tank on a tower that had developed a slight lean to the east. A dog came off the porch at a trot, tail moving in wide arcs. It was a big brown dog with a grey muzzle and the unhurried confidence of an animal that had decided long ago that most things were fine. "That's Hector," Cal said. The dog came around to Malin's side of the wagon and sat down and looked up at her with an expression of complete and uncritical openness. She looked back at it. She did not reach down to pet it, but she didn't pull away either. Cal noticed. He didn't say anything about it. Inside, the house was what he'd said it was. Nothing fancy, but solid. A main room with a stone fireplace, a table big enough for 6, a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and coffee. A lamp burning on the table, already lit against the coming dark. Someone, Cal, she assumed, had put a small bunch of dried wildflowers in a jar on the windowsill. They were the kind of flowers that grew along roadsides in late summer, gone brown at the edges now, but the gesture was legible. He had tried to make it welcoming. She stood in the doorway of the main room and looked at the dried flowers and felt something move through her chest that she did not examine too closely. "Your room is through there," Cal said, nodding toward a door on the far wall. "I figured you'd want your own space, to get settled, get a feel for things before—" He stopped. "Well, before anything." "Thank you," she said. "I'll get the pot roast warmed up." She carried her satchel into the room he'd indicated and closed the door behind her. It was a small room, a bed with a quilt, a washstand, a window that looked out toward the barn. Clean. The quilt was old but had been laundered recently. There was a small mirror on the wall. She set the satchel on the bed and opened it and looked at what was inside. The vial was there. Small brown glass stoppered with wax. Voss's man had told her it was tasteless in coffee or water, that it would look like a heart event, that there would be no questions asked for a man who worked as hard as Cal Pruitt worked. "Clean," the man had said. "Professional." She picked it up and held it for a moment. Then she set it back in the satchel and went to wash her face. She had 3 days. There was no reason to rush. That was what she told herself. Dinner was the pot roast and bread and a jar of pickled vegetables that Cal had clearly been saving for a special occasion, because when he brought it out, he looked at it the way men look at things they've been talked into by their better instincts. They ate at the big table with the lamp between them, throwing shadows up the walls. He asked her about Sacramento. She told him about the city, the docks, the markets, the way the fog came in off the river in the mornings. She told him about her father's laundry, about the smell of steam and starch that she'd grown up inside of. She did not tell him about the years after she'd left, about the work she'd fallen into, about the 6 years of moving from city to city with a satchel and a set of skills that had no polite name. He listened the way some men listen, not waiting for his turn to talk, but actually taking in what she said. It was disarming. She had been trained, in the informal way that people in her line of work train themselves, to stay at a certain distance from targets, to keep the relationship functional and transactional in her own mind, even when she was performing warmth. Cal Pruitt made that harder than usual. Not because he was remarkable in any obvious way. He wasn't. He was a rancher who read too slowly and laughed too rarely, and had spent so many years being practical that he'd almost forgotten how to want things. But there was something in the way he treated the space between them, carefully with a kind of respect that wasn't performance, that she found herself noticing in a way she hadn't intended to notice. "Why the agency?" she asked. It was forward. She asked it anyway. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I'm not good at the other way," he said. "The social way. Never have been. I thought—" He stopped, tried again. "I thought if I could find someone who was also practical about it, who wanted the same things, a real life, work, stability. I thought maybe that was a better foundation than—" He shrugged. "Than whatever else people do." "What do people do?" she said. "Fall in love first and figure out the rest later," he said. "That's worked out fine for some people, I guess." She looked at him across the lamp. "You don't believe in it," she said. It wasn't a question. He was quiet for a moment. "I believe in it," he said. "I just think it's something that grows, not something that arrives." She thought about that for the rest of the evening. She thought about it while she washed the dishes and Cal dried them, and they stood at the kitchen counter in a silence that was oddly comfortable for two people who had met 4 hours ago. She thought about it when Hector came and lay down across her feet while she sat by the fire and she let him, which surprised her. She thought about it when she said goodnight and went to her room and lay on the quilt in the dark and listened to the Nevada wind move across the roof. 3 days. She had done harder jobs in less time. She closed her eyes and told herself that tomorrow she would make a plan. She woke before dawn to the sound of Cal moving in the kitchen, the particular quiet efficiency of a man who had been waking up alone for years and had learned to make as little noise as possible out of habit. She heard the fire being coaxed up, the sound of the coffee pot being filled from the pump. She lay still and listened to it, and felt the strangeness of being in a house where someone was moving around for reasons that had nothing to do with her. She got up and dressed and went to the kitchen. Cal looked up from the stove. He had the look of a man who had expected to be alone for another hour and was recalibrating. "You don't have to be up," he said. "I don't sleep late," she said. He handed her a cup of coffee without being asked. She took it and stood at the window and looked out at the yard in the grey pre-dawn light. The barn was a dark shape. The water tank leaned its patient lean. Somewhere out in the dark, cattle were moving. She could hear the low, distant sound of them. "I'm going to check the east fence this morning," Cal said. "Doss thinks there's a section down. You're welcome to come, if you want to see the land." She turned from the window. "All right," she said. She told herself it was reconnaissance. She told herself she needed to understand the terrain, the layout, the patterns of his days. She told herself this was professional. She was not entirely lying. They rode out as the sun came up, Cal on a grey horse named Frank, and Mei Lin on a smaller bay that he'd saddled without asking if she could ride. She could ride. She'd learned in the mountains outside of Reno from a man who'd taught her several things that had later proved useful. She settled into the saddle with the ease of someone who had done it many times, and Cal noticed this the way he seemed to notice most things, quietly, without comment. The east pasture was about 2 miles from the house, past a dry creek bed and a stand of juniper that threw long shadows in the morning light. The fence, when they found it, had been pushed down in a section about 30 feet long, not broken, but leaned over, the wire still intact but the posts tilted at angles that suggested something large had come through. Cal got down and walked the section, crouching to look at the ground. He found what he was looking for: hoofprints, multiple sets, the kind of churned earth that meant a significant number of animals had been moved through here deliberately. He stood up and looked at the prints for a long time without saying anything. "Someone cut your cattle," she said. "Looks like." His voice was flat. Not angry exactly. The anger was there, but it was underneath something heavier. 3rd time this season. She got down from the bay and walked the fence line. She was looking at the posts. They hadn't been pushed down by cattle from the inside. The angle was wrong. Someone had come from outside and laid the fence down to move animals through. She looked at the tracks. She looked at the direction they led, east toward the ridge that marked the boundary between Pruitt Land and Voss Land. She looked at the ridge for a moment. Then she looked back at Cal. "You know who's doing it," she said. He picked up a fence post and set it back in the hole, pressing it down with his boot. "I've got ideas," he said. "Harlan Voss," she said. He looked at her sharply. "You know that name?" She had made a mistake. Small, but real. She kept her face neutral. "I heard it in town," she said. "At the boarding house. May Hollis mentioned there'd been trouble between you and a neighbour." He held her eyes for a moment. Then he went back to the fence post. "Voss has been trying to buy this land for 2 years," he said. "When I wouldn't sell, the trouble started. Cattle missing, water diverted, a fire in the south barn last spring that I can't prove but I know." He set another post. "He's patient. He figures if he makes it hard enough, I'll give up. Will you?" He looked up at her from where he was crouching. The sun was fully up now, hitting the sage and turning it silver. "No," he said. Simply, she believed him. That was the problem. She believed him entirely, and she understood for the first time, not as information she'd gathered, but as something she felt. What Voss was trying to take, and why Cal wouldn't give it. She picked up the other end of the wire and held it taut while he worked, and they fixed the fence together in the morning light, and neither of them said anything more about Harlan Voss. But she was thinking about him. She was thinking about the fact that Voss had hired her not just to clear the way for a land grab, but to solve a problem he'd been unable to solve any other way. That the cattle theft, the fire, the water diversion, all of it had failed. Cal Pruitt had stood through all of it. And now Voss had sent someone to stand in his house. She thought about this while they rode back. She thought about the vial in her satchel. She thought about the money. She thought about what she'd said she was going to do and what she was actually going to do. And she understood, somewhere around the point where the dry creek bed came back into view, that these two things were no longer the same. She hadn't decided anything yet. That was what she told herself. But something had shifted in the east pasture, somewhere between the tilted fence posts and the honest man crouching in the dirt, and she could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. That afternoon, while Cal was in the barn with Doss, she walked the property. She told herself she was still working. She was, in a way, just not the job she'd been hired for. She walked the perimeter of the yard, the path to the barn, the track that led down to the dry creek. She looked at the land the way she'd been trained to look at things, but the longer she walked, the more the professional eye gave way to something else. She began to see the ranch the way Cal must see it, not as acreage and water rights and a number on a deed, but as a particular arrangement of the world that someone had spent 30 years building and tending and defending. The garden plot behind the house, gone to frost now but carefully laid out, the stakes still in the ground for next year. The water tank with its patient lean, held up by a brace that Cal had clearly built himself from salvaged lumber. The barn, which had been repaired in sections over the years so that you could read its history in the different ages of the wood. Old grey planks and newer yellow ones, and one corner that was practically new, probably the section that had burned. A life, assembled piece by piece, held together by work and stubbornness, and the refusal to give up what was yours. She sat down on the fence rail at the edge of the yard and looked at the mountains in the distance and thought about her own life, which was also assembled piece by piece but in a different way. Each piece a departure, a burning of something behind her, a door closed and locked. She had been moving since she was 22. She had been good at moving. She had told herself for 6 years that the moving was the point, that freedom was the point, that belonging nowhere was a kind of strength. Sitting on Cal Pruitt's fence rail in the October afternoon, she was not entirely sure she still believed that. Hector came and sat beside her. He put his grey muzzle on her knee and looked up at her with the expression of an animal who had already decided the question. She put her hand on his head. She sat there for a long time. When Cal came out of the barn an hour later and saw her there with the dog, he stopped for a moment in the barn doorway and looked at the picture they made. The woman on the fence rail, the old dog with his head in her lap, the mountains behind them going blue in the afternoon light. He stood there longer than he needed to. Then he went inside to start dinner. That night after dinner she walked out to the porch alone. The sky over Nevada was the kind of sky that only exists in places far from cities. Absolute dark, absolute stars. The Milky Way a smear of light that felt close enough to touch. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since sundown, and her breath made small clouds in the lamplight from the window. She heard the door open behind her. Cal came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed her one, and stood beside her at the porch rail. He didn't say anything. He just stood there looking at the same sky. This was the second night. She had 1 day left. She thought about Voss. She thought about what Voss would do if she came back empty-handed. Not just the loss of the money, but the other thing, The thing she'd understood from the way Voss's man had looked at her in that Sacramento hotel room. Men like Voss didn't hire people they intended to let walk away if the job went wrong. She had known this when she took the job. She had told herself it didn't matter, that she was capable enough to handle whatever came after. She was still capable enough. That hadn't changed. What had changed was that she was standing on a porch in the dark with a man she'd known for 36 hours, drinking coffee in the cold, and she did not want to be anywhere else. That was new. "You're not sleeping," Cal said. It wasn't a question. "I'm thinking," she said. "About what?" She looked at the stars. "About what I'm going to do," she said. He turned to look at her. In the lamplight from the window, his face was half in shadow, and she could see him trying to read her. Not suspiciously, but with the careful attention of someone who has learned to pay attention to things that don't quite add up. "Mei Lin," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Are you all right?" The question was so direct and so simple and so far from what she'd expected that she didn't answer immediately. She held her coffee cup with both hands and looked at the mountains and thought about what all right meant and whether she was it. "I don't know yet," she said finally. He nodded. Like that was an acceptable answer. Like he'd been given answers like that before and knew what to do with them. "You don't have to decide anything," he said, "about any of it. I know this is..." He stopped. "I know this isn't a normal situation. What I said about growing into things, I meant it. There's no pressure." She looked at him. "I know," she said. They stood there a while longer. The cold came in from the desert and the stars didn't move, and somewhere out in the dark a coyote called once and went quiet. When they finally went inside, Cal stopped at the door and held it open for her, and she walked past him into the warmth of the house, and for just a moment, the length of a breath, she was close enough that she could have reached out and touched his arm. She didn't, but she wanted to. She went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and picked up the satchel and held it in her lap. Then she set it down on the floor and lay back on the quilt and looked at the ceiling. She was not going to use the vial. She had known this, she realized, since the east fence. Maybe since the platform. Maybe since Hector had put his head in her lap. She had been performing deliberation for 2 days when the decision had already been made somewhere below the level of thought, in the part of her that was older and more honest than the professional machinery she'd built around it. But not using the vial was not the same as being safe, and it was not the same as Cal being safe. She thought about Voss. She thought about what he would do next. She thought about the man he'd sent to meet her in Sacramento, a compact, careful man named Riles, who'd given her the vial and the timeline, and a description of the target with the flat effect of someone who did this regularly. Riles would be somewhere nearby. Voss always had a contingency. That was how men like Voss operated. They didn't trust anyone completely, which meant they always had a second option waiting. If she didn't finish the job by tomorrow, Riles would know, and Riles would act. Which meant Cal was in danger whether she did anything or not. She sat up. She thought for a long time. Then she got up and went to the small writing desk in the corner of the room and found paper and a pencil and began to write. She wrote for an hour. When she was done, she folded the paper and set it on the desk and looked at it. Then she went back to bed and slept for the first time in 3 days. She was up before Cal the next morning. She had coffee made when he came into the kitchen, and she handed him a cup before he'd fully realized that she was there. He took it with the slightly dazed expression of a man who has spent years making his own coffee and has just had that small loneliness removed without warning. "I need to tell you something," she said. He looked at her over the rim of the cup. "All right," he said. She told him. Not everything. Not the 6 years. Not the full accounting of her work. But she told him about Voss, about the hotel room in Sacramento, about the vial in her satchel, about Riles, who was almost certainly in Colton right now, watching the ranch from some patient distance, waiting for a sign that the job was done or wasn't. She told him straight, without softening it, standing at the kitchen counter with her coffee getting cold. She watched his face while she talked. She had expected anger. She had expected the kind of cold withdrawal that men used when they felt they'd been made a fool of. She had prepared herself for it. What she got was stillness. Cal set his cup down on the counter. He looked at the window, at the yard coming into morning light outside. He stood very still for a long time. Then he said, "The vial is still in your bag." "Yes," she said. "You've had 3 days." "Yes," he looked at her. "Why?" She held his eyes. Because I didn't want to, she said, and then because I couldn't, and then because I needed to figure out what to do about Riles. He was quiet for another moment. Then, what do you want to do about Riles? She had thought about this all night. I want to draw him in, she said. Make him think the job is done. Get him onto the property where we can deal with him on our terms. Cal said. If you'll let me, she said. He looked at her for a long time. The morning light was coming through the window and it fell across the kitchen table, and the dried flowers on the windowsill, and the 2 coffee cups and the space between them. You could have left, he said, gone back to Sacramento, let whatever happened happen. I know, she said. Why didn't you? She looked at the dried flowers in the jar. They were the colour of old straw, brown at the edges, but they were still there, still standing in their jar, still the gesture they'd been when he'd put them there. Because it would have happened to you, she said. Cal picked up his coffee cup. He drank from it. He set it back down. Tell me about Riles, he said. She told him. Riles was methodical. He would have a position, somewhere with a sight line to the house, close enough to observe but far enough to have options. He would have been watching the ranch for at least 2 days, probably from the ridge to the east. He would be waiting for a signal, some sign that the job was complete, before he moved in to confirm and collect the vial as proof for Voss. If no signal came by nightfall of the 3rd day, he would act independently. Tonight was the 3rd night. The ridge, Cal said. I know a way up from the south side. He won't expect approach from there. You've done this before, she said. Not this exactly, he said, but I've tracked things before, men sometimes. This is my land. I know every inch of it. She believed him. She had believed him since the east fence. They spent the morning preparing. Cal found Doss and told him to take the horses to the south pasture and stay there until Cal sent word. He gave Doss a reason that wasn't the real reason, and Doss, who had the good sense of a man who has worked for someone trustworthy for 7 years, asked no questions and went. Maylin went through her satchel and took out what she needed. She had a small revolver, a .38, compact, reliable. She had carried it for 6 years, and she knew its weight the way she knew the weight of her own hand. She checked it and set it in her coat pocket. She picked up the vial. She looked at it for a moment. Then she walked to the fireplace and dropped it into the flames and watched the glass blacken and crack in the heat. Cal was watching from the doorway. She turned around. All right, she said. Let's talk about the ridge. They moved out in the early afternoon while the sun was still high enough to matter. Cal took the south approach the way he'd described, a long arc through the juniper, following the dry creek bed, coming up onto the ridge from the blind side. Maylin moved beside him and slightly behind, letting him lead on terrain he knew, covering the angles he couldn't see. They moved quietly. Cal moved the way ranchers move in rough country, economically, without wasted motion, reading the ground ahead. She moved the way she moved, which was differently, with a different kind of attention, but the effect was the same. They were quiet together in a way that had its own kind of coherence. They found Riles where she'd said he'd be. He was set up in a hollow just below the ridgeline, with a clear view of the ranch house and a rifle across his knees. He was a compact man in a brown coat, and he was watching the house through a small scope with the patience of someone who had done this many times. He didn't hear them until Cal was 10 feet behind him, and by then Cal had the rifle from the scabbard on his back and Maylin had the .38, and Riles, who was professional enough to assess a situation accurately, set his own rifle down in the dirt. That's sensible, Cal said. Riles looked at Maylin. You went soft, he said. His voice was flat, not accusatory, just observational, the way a man notes that the weather has changed. I made a different decision, she said. Voss won't like it. Voss, Cal said, is going to have bigger problems than not liking it. They brought Riles down from the ridge with his hands bound and his rifle left on the hillside. Cal locked him in the tack room in the barn. Solid walls, one door, a lock that had been keeping things secure since 1878, and went to find Doss, who rode to town to fetch the sheriff. The sheriff was a man named Aldridge, who had been dealing with Harlan Voss's various operations for 3 years and had been waiting, with the particular patience of a lawman who knows the evidence is coming eventually, for something solid enough to act on. Riles, who understood the arithmetic of his situation clearly, provided that something in exchange for a consideration on his own charges. By the following morning, Harlan Voss was in custody in the Colton County Jail, and the land dispute that had been running for 2 years was suddenly very much a matter for the courts, rather than the high desert. Cal came back to the house in the late afternoon of that day and found Maylin on the porch with Hector, both of them looking at the mountains. He came and stood beside her at the rail, and they looked at the mountains together, and the light was doing what it did in Nevada in October, going long and gold and impossible, the kind of light that makes the ordinary world look briefly like something worth all the trouble it takes to stay in it. "You could go," Cal said. "If you wanted, there's nothing holding you here." She looked at the mountains. "I know," she said. "But," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with those honest eyes, and she thought about what he'd said on the first night, that love was something that grew, not something that arrived. She thought about the dried flowers in the jar and the quilt that had been laundered, and the fence they'd fixed together in the morning light. She thought about Hector, who was currently sitting on her feet. "I'm not sure I want to go," she said. Cal was quiet for a moment. "That's not a promise," he said. "No," she said. "It's not." "It's enough," he said. They stood there while the light changed and the mountains went from gold to purple, and the first stars appeared above the eastern ridge. The wind came down off the high country and moved through the sage and brought the smell of cold and distance with it, and neither of them moved away from it. Hector sighed and resettled himself across her feet. Inside, the lamp was burning on the kitchen table, and the coffee was on, and the house was warm against the coming dark. There are things that happen in the world that don't have a clean story shape. They don't have a moment where you can point and say, "There, that's where it changed. That's the turn. That's the before and after." The change is more like weather. It comes in from a direction you weren't watching and settles over everything, and by the time you notice it, it's already been there for a while. What happened between Cal Pruitt and the woman who had come to his door with a satchel and a false purpose was like that. There was no single moment. There was the east fence and the dried flowers and the coffee and the cold and the ridge and the locked tack room and the afternoon light. There was Hector, who had decided from the first moment on the platform that this was fine, that this was how it was supposed to go, and who had simply proceeded on that understanding with the serene authority of an animal that knows things humans are still working out. The courts dealt with Harlan Voss over the following months: the cattle theft, the arson, the conspiracy charges that Riles' testimony made possible. It was a long, grinding legal process, the kind that tests patience, but it moved in the right direction. Voss's land holdings were tied up in the proceedings. The water rights dispute was resolved in Cal's favour by the following spring. The Pruitt Ranch stayed the Pruitt Ranch. Maylin stayed through the first snow. She told herself she was staying to see the legal process through, to be available as a witness if needed. This was partly true. There was a deposition, and she gave it, and the county attorney was thorough and professional, and asked her no questions she couldn't answer. But she also stayed because the ranch in winter was a different thing than the ranch in October, and she wanted to know it. She wanted to know what it looked like when the creek bed filled with the first runoff from the mountains and the cattle came back from the south pasture, and the garden plot got turned over for spring planting. She wanted to know what it was like to be somewhere long enough to see it change. She learned things that winter. She learned that Cal woke up at 4:30 every morning without an alarm, and that he was useless at conversation until the second cup of coffee. She learned that he read slowly but retained everything, that he had a shelf of books he'd read so many times the spines had given out. She learned that he was patient with animals and occasionally impatient with machinery, and that when something broke he fixed it himself before considering any other option, and that this was both a practical skill and a kind of philosophy. He learned things about her too. Some of them she told him, some of them he simply observed, the way he observed most things, quietly, without making a production of it. He learned that she was a better shot than anyone in the county, which became locally known after a shooting competition at the spring fair that she won without appearing to try. He learned that she had a particular way of going still when she was thinking hard, like a pool of water when the wind drops. He learned that she laughed rarely, but when she did, it was real, and that it changed her face in a way that was worth waiting for. He didn't ask her about the 6 years. She told him, eventually, not all at once, but in pieces, over the course of months, in the way that people tell the things they've been carrying when they finally find somewhere safe enough to set them down. He listened to all of it the same way he listened to everything, without flinching, without judgment, with the full and quiet attention of a man who had decided somewhere around the east fence on that first morning that this was someone worth knowing all the way through. She had been right about one thing she'd said on the porch that first night. It wasn't a promise, but it grew. It grew the way he'd said it did, not arriving but accumulating day by day in the specific and ordinary currency of shared life. In the meals cooked and the fences fixed and the mornings where they stood at the kitchen window and watched the light come up over the ridge together. In the arguments, which were real and occasional and resolved without drama because both of them were too practical for drama. In the silences, which became the kind of silences that are their own form of conversation. Hector lived another 2 years. He died in the spring in his usual spot on the porch, in the sun, with his grey muzzle on his paws and the look of an animal who had completed his work and was satisfied with it. Cal buried him at the edge of the east pasture, near the fence they'd fixed together that first morning, and Maylin stood beside him while he did it. And they didn't say much, because there wasn't much to say, and because some things are honoured better by presence than by words. They married the following autumn. The ceremony was small, the county judge, Doss as witness, May Hollis from the boarding house, who cried at everything and was not embarrassed about it. Maylin wore a dress the colour of the sage in morning light, and Cal wore his good jacket, and they stood in the yard of the ranch in the October afternoon and said the words and meant them. It was not a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was a life, actual and specific and built from the ground up, by two people who had each come to it carrying things they hadn't expected to set down, and had set them down anyway, because the ground here was solid enough to hold the weight. There is a version of this story where it's about what Maylin gave up. The freedom of motion, the work she'd been good at, the particular independence of a person who belongs nowhere and therefore can't be touched. There is a version where that loss is the centre of the story, and the marriage is a kind of surrender. That is not the version she would tell. What she would say, if you asked her, and some people did eventually as the years went on, and the story of the woman who'd come off the train with a satchel, became one of those local stories that gets passed around and polished and improved in the telling. What she would say was this. She had spent 6 years being very good at leaving. She'd been so good at it that she'd confused it with strength. The leaving, the lightness, the refusal to be held by anything. She'd thought that was what freedom looked like. What she found in the east pasture on a cold October morning, holding a fence wire taut while a man she'd meant to harm fixed what someone else had broken, was that freedom was not the same as lightness, that you could be free and still be rooted, that the two things were not opposites, that belonging somewhere to someone of your own choosing, that was not a cage. That was the whole point. The ranch is still there. The water tank no longer leans. Cal replaced it in the 2nd year. The garden plot produces reliably in summer. The shelf of books has grown. There is a new dog, younger and less philosophical than Hector, who has not yet fully grown into his wisdom, but is working on it. And in the east pasture, near the fence line, there is a section of posts that are a slightly different colour than the rest. Newer wood, set in straighter, the wire tighter. You'd only notice if you were looking, if you knew what you were seeing. They hold the line. They have held it for years. If you've stayed with this story to the end, you already know what it's really about. It's not about a mail-order bride or a bounty hunter, or even a land dispute in Colton County, Nevada. It's about the thing that happens when a person who has spent years running finally finds a reason to stop, and has the courage to stay still long enough to find out what grows. There are more stories like this one. Stories about people who arrived somewhere unexpected and found something they hadn't gone looking for. If that's what you're here for, hit that subscribe button and stay with us. Leave a comment below if you want to tell us which part of this one landed for you. And if you know someone who needs a story about second chances and earned trust and a dog with good instincts, send this to them. We'll see you in the next one.